house on Willow Street was the kind people called quaint. A modest two-story home with weathered wooden siding, an old oak tree in the front yard, and a porch swing that groaned when the wind blew. It was the perfect place for a family, a place where memories were meant to be made, where love should have flourished. But inside one of its bedrooms, something else had begun to grow. Something unseen, something wrong. Ethan Parker was only 7 years old, but he had always been a quiet, perceptive child. He never caused much trouble, never threw tantrums, and rarely cried, even when he scraped his knee or lost a favorite toy. His parents, Daniel and Claire, thought of him as thoughtful, maybe even a little too mature for his age. But lately, he had changed. It started with the whispers. At first, Claire assumed he was talking to himself, the way some children did when playing alone. She would walk past his room in the evening and hear faint murmurs, soft and rhythmic, almost like a lullaby spoken in a language she didn't understand. But when she peeked inside, Ethan would be lying still up in bed, facing the wall, his small chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. Then came the complaints. "Mommy, someone is under my bed at night." The first time he said it, Claire had smiled, ruffled his sandy brown hair, and assured him that it was just his imagination, a trick of the dark. "It's just shadows," she had said. "Nothing can hurt you." But Ethan wasn't convinced. Night after night, his parents heard him shuffle in bed, breathing heavily, clutching his blanket as though it were a shield. And night after night, his small voice would drift through the hall. "Mommy, someone is under my bed." Daniel, a logical man who believed every problem had a reasonable explanation, checked beneath Ethan's bed himself. He even got down on his hands and knees, pressing his face to the cool hardwood floor. Nothing, just the usual collection of forgotten toys, a stray sock, and the faint scent of lavender fabric softener from the freshly washed sheets. "See, buddy, there's nothing there," Daniel had said, patting the boy's back. "Just dreams, bad dreams." Ethan didn't argue, but he also didn't sleep. The nights stretched on, each one heavier than the last. Ethan became pale, his small face hollowed by sleeplessness. Dark circles bloomed under his wide eyes, eyes that darted constantly toward the bed, as though something might slither out from beneath it at any moment. Then came the scratching. It started as a faint skittering noise, like nails dragging against the wooden floor. Claire had assumed it was mice. Old houses often had their share of pests. But when an exterminator found no sign of rodents, the noise only became harder to explain. It grew louder, more deliberate, as if whatever was making it wanted to be heard. Ethan stopped playing with his toys. He refused to be alone in his room, even during the day. He flinched at shadows and kept his feet off the floor as much as possible. And then, one night, he screamed, a raw, piercing sound that made Claire and Daniel bolt from their bed, their hearts hammering in their chests. They rushed to Ethan's room, fumbling with the door in the dark, breathless with panic. When they finally reached him, they found their son curled up against the headboard, his knees drawn to his chest, his face twisted in silent terror. Claire rushed to him, wrapping her arms around his trembling body. His skin was ice cold, his little hands balled into fists. But he wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the edge of the bed. His lips moved, but the words barely came out. A whisper, a whimper. "He's under there," Ethan murmured. Claire and Daniel exchanged uneasy glances before Daniel, ever the rational one, knelt down and lifted the bedskirt. There was nothing. No monsters, no shadows, no explanation. But Ethan refused to believe it. And that was when Claire saw something that sent a chill up her spine. In the dim glow of the nightlight, Ethan's eyes were glistening with unshed tears. His small mouth was moving, whispering something over and over again. His gaze was distant, unfocused, as though he were repeating something he had been told. "He's under there," he whispered again, "and he says he's real." Claire felt a deep, unsettling dread coil in her stomach. That night she let Ethan sleep in their bed. She and Daniel reassured themselves that it was just a phase, that Ethan would grow out of his fear in time, that all children had nightmares. But as she lay awake, Ethan's tiny body pressed against hers, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. And downstairs, in the silent house, the scratching continued. The nights dragged on, each one worse than the last. Ethan barely spoke anymore. He sat through meals without eating, his fork moving food around his plate in aimless patterns. His small frame seemed even smaller now, swallowed by the oversized sweater he refused to take off. His parents had stopped asking him to sleep in his room, instead letting him doze off on the couch or in their bed. But even there, his sleep was thin and restless. The house felt different, not just because of Ethan, but because of something else, something neither Claire nor Daniel could name. It was in the way the air seemed heavier after sunset, the way the floorboards creaked even when no one was moving. It was in the faint chill that settled in Ethan's room, no matter how high they turned up the heat. They told themselves it was all in their heads, that exhaustion was playing tricks on them. Then, one evening, Ethan did something unexpected. As Claire tucked him into the couch, brushing the hair from his tired eyes, he grabbed her wrist. His fingers were ice cold, his grip surprisingly strong. She looked down at him, startled. He didn't speak, just stared at her with a look she couldn't describe. Part fear, part exhaustion, part something else. Then, without a word, he let go and turned away, pulling the blanket up to his chin. Claire stood there for a moment, unsettled. She told herself he was just tired, that he would be better in the morning. But she knew that wasn't true. Ethan didn't wake up screaming that night. He didn't call for them or beg to sleep in their bed. Instead, the house was unnervingly silent, the kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful, only wrong. Sometime past midnight, Ethan opened his eyes. The darkness around him was thick and endless, pressing against him like something alive. The nightlight in the hallway flickered weakly, casting pale, dying light through the half-open doorway. For the first time in weeks, Ethan didn't hesitate. He sat up, swung his legs over the edge of the bed, and looked underneath. His breath caught in his throat. There, lying on the floor in the suffocating darkness, was himself. Ethan stared, his heart hammering against his ribs. The figure beneath the bed was identical to him in every way. The same small frame, the same messy hair, the same wide, frightened eyes. But there was something wrong. The other Ethan wasn't just lying there. He was whispering. The words were soft and broken, but clear. "I'm real." Ethan's body locked up, his limbs frozen in place. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but he couldn't move. The other Ethan blinked slowly, his lips parting again. "I'm real," he whispered again. Then he smiled. The grin stretched too wide, his lips curling back to reveal small, sharp teeth. It wasn't a smile of comfort. It was something else, something unnatural. Ethan wanted to shut his eyes to pretend he hadn't seen it, But it was too late. The other Ethan moved. Not in a normal way. Not like a person should. His body jerked, his limbs folding in strange, unnatural angles as he dragged himself forward, inching out from beneath the bed. Ethan let out a strangled gasp, his body finally responding, scrambling backward until his spine hit the headboard. The thing on the floor kept moving, pulling itself into the dim light. Its body was his, but wrong. The skin was too pale, the fingers too long, the way it moved too broken. It cocked its head, its wide, hollow eyes locking onto Ethan's. Then it whispered again, "I'm real." Ethan didn't remember screaming, but Claire and Daniel came rushing into the room, their panic-stricken faces appearing in the doorway. "What happened?" Claire demanded, flipping on the light. Ethan's mouth opened, but no words came out. The other Ethan was gone. The space beneath the bed was empty, just wood and shadows. His parents found him curled up against the headboard, shaking violently. They held him, rocked him, tried to calm him down. But Ethan couldn't stop crying, because he knew it was real, and it wasn't gone. It was just waiting for the right moment. After that night, Ethan refused to sleep in his room. No amount of coaxing, comforting, or logic could convince him otherwise. His parents were at a loss. They tried everything: doctors, therapists, sleep aids. Nothing worked, because it wasn't just the bed anymore. The whispers followed him everywhere. He heard them in the walls, in the vents, in the spaces between the furniture. "I'm real." He stopped talking, stopped eating. His eyes were always darting, watching, waiting for something no one else could see. Then the scratching returned. Only this time it wasn't coming from the floor. It was coming from inside the walls. Daniel and Claire thought they were losing their minds. They tore the house apart looking for an explanation, checking the vents, the attic, the crawl spaces. Nothing. But the noises didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. At night, Claire would wake up to the faint sound of something breathing just beyond the bedroom walls. Daniel would hear Ethan's voice whispering from under the bed, even when Ethan was nowhere near it. Shadows moved when no one was there to cast them. And Ethan was fading. His skin grew sickly pale, his eyes sunken and dark. He hardly spoke, hardly moved. It was as if something was draining the life out of him, pulling him away from the world, one slow, agonizing inch at a time. Then, one night, Claire woke up and felt it. Something was in the bed with them. A weight, a presence, pressed against the mattress. She turned her head slowly, her breath catching in her throat. And there, lying between her and Daniel, was Ethan. Only, it wasn't. The thing smiled. Too wide, too sharp. Its lips moved, forming the words that had haunted their home for weeks. "I'm real." The lights flickered. Claire's scream tore through the house. Then everything went dark. The house was silent. Not the kind of peaceful silence that comes with sleep or the hush of a quiet evening, but the suffocating, unnatural stillness of something wrong. Claire sat upright in bed, heart hammering, the echo of her own scream still ringing in her ears. The weight on the mattress was gone, the room seemingly empty, but her skin crawled, every nerve in her body screaming that something had just been there. She turned to Daniel. He was already awake, sitting up, his face pale and drenched in sweat. His breath came in ragged gasps, and in the dim light, she could see the raw terror in his eyes. Between them, the space where Ethan had been, where the thing had been, was cold. Claire threw the blankets aside, scrambling to her feet. She barely noticed the sting of the cold floor against her bare soles as she bolted for the door, yanking it open. "Ethan." Her voice felt too small, too fragile against the silence. Daniel was right behind her, footsteps heavy and frantic. The hallway stretched ahead, impossibly long in the darkness, and at the end of it, Ethan's bedroom door stood wide open. Claire ran. The shadows in the hallway seemed to pulse and twist around her as she moved, and for one horrible second she felt like the walls were breathing. She reached Ethan's doorway and froze. The room was empty. The blankets lay crumpled on the bed, the nightlight still flickering weakly. The closet doors were open, revealing nothing but neatly hung clothes. And beneath the bed, there was nothing. No Ethan. No thing. Just an empty, yawning blackness that seemed to stretch too far. Daniel pushed past her, lunging for the bed, yanking the sheets aside. "Ethan." His voice cracked. "Ethan, where are you, buddy?" Claire turned in a slow circle, her breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. The air felt heavy, charged, wrong, like the moment before a storm, when everything holds its breath. She stepped forward, then stopped. Her bare foot had touched something wet. Slowly, Claire looked down. A thin, oily black substance seeped from under the bed, pooling outward like ink. It was thick, shimmering under the dim light, pulsing as though it were alive. She recoiled, a choked sound escaping her throat. "Daniel." But Daniel wasn't listening. He had dropped to his knees, looking under the bed. Claire's stomach lurched. "Daniel, don't." Too late. Daniel's face twisted in confusion. What the hell? Then his expression changed. Confusion melted into horror. His eyes widened. His breathing quickened. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Claire saw his hands trembling. Then he yanked himself back, fast, too fast, like he had almost been pulled. Daniel scrambled to his feet, stumbling backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His face was drained of color. "What did you see?" Claire whispered. Daniel shook his head, but his hands wouldn't stop shaking. "We have to go," he choked out. "What?" Daniel grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. "We have to go, now." Claire yanked free. "Not without Ethan." Daniel looked at her then, and the expression on his face killed something inside her, because it wasn't just fear. It was hopelessness. "Claire," he whispered. "He's not here." Claire's heart stopped. "What are you talking about?" Daniel swallowed hard. His eyes flicked back to the bed. "I saw him," he whispered. "I saw Ethan." Claire felt hope surge inside her. "Then where is he? Where?" Daniel shook his head again. His voice was barely a breath. "That wasn't our son." Claire's stomach dropped. "No." She took a step toward the bed. "No, he's just hiding. He's scared. Ethan." Her voice was pleading now, desperate, but the room remained silent. Then, the nightlight flickered, and the whispers began again. Software, slithering, all around them. The walls groaned like something pressing against them from the other side. Daniel grabbed her wrist again. "We have to go." The black substance had spread. It oozed across the floor, slithering toward them, like it had a mind of its own. The whispering grew louder. "I'm real." The lights flickered again, and then went out completely. The room was swallowed by darkness, and in that moment, Claire felt it. Something was standing right behind her, breathing, grinning. A small, wet voice whispered in her ear. "I'm real," she screamed. The police found nothing. Ethan Parker was officially listed as a missing child. His parents' desperate explanations made no sense. Stories of shadows and whispers, of something wearing their son's face. The investigators found no signs of forced entry, no struggle, No footprints leading away from the house. Ethan was just gone. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Claire and Daniel stopped talking, stopped living. Daniel barely left their bedroom. Claire spent hours in Ethan's empty room, sitting on his bed, staring at the wall, listening. The whispers were gone now, but the silence was worse. And then, one night, she heard it. Software. Small. A giggle. Claire turned slowly and froze. There, standing in the doorway, was Ethan, or something that looked like Ethan. His skin was pale. His smile was too wide. And when he spoke, his voice was a whisper. "I'm real." Weeks later, the neighbors reported an awful smell coming from the Parker house. When the police arrived, they found no one. The house was empty. The furniture remained untouched, dust settling over every surface. The beds were made, dishes still in the sink. But the family was gone. The only thing left behind was a notebook, open on the dining table. One sentence was scrawled across the final page, written over and over in frantic, desperate strokes. "Do not look under the bed." The ink was still wet, and in the silence of the empty house, if you listened closely enough, you could still hear it. A whisper, a giggle. "I'm real."